perceived differently by men and women, so we perceive the threats differently, and we've got different coping strategies. And sometimes, if you consider your own role that you play in security, risk management, or security in general, it's interesting to ask yourself that question: have you considered the security approach differently from those different perspectives? So women are often confronted with maybe restrictive environments or cultural beliefs, which is sort of the external environment in which we're all operating. But as well as that, within the security bubble, if you like, women sometimes feel they must prove something, they must keep up. And in order to be respected, they must not show any weakness as well. And I must say, myself, I've often felt that on heat courses that I've done, that you are not really there to show weakness, and you have to just keep up and keep going. Stereotypes. We're very, very much aware of these stereotypes. Biologically, women might be perceived as being weaker, and there may be discrimination both in the organisation itself and also in the external environment. And that can feed into some of the security issues that we'll discuss as we go through. Now, sometimes discrimination can include the issues of internal policies, but sometimes these can be exacerbated in terms of the external context that people find themselves in terms of the behaviour, the gender roles, and the equality as perceived by the wider community. I've also put in the fourth bullet there: international women sometimes being perceived as being gender ambiguous, this idea of the third sex. And again, there was quite a lot of work being done with the military, going into situations of conflict and having both the opportunity to be perceived as a military soldier or officer, and therefore being able to attend some of the briefings with the local community, but also as a double, also being able to actually go into liaise with women's groups as well. However, it was kind of like sometimes a double-edged sword, because you were then playing into some of those perceptions and beliefs that in some contexts are around international women being promiscuous, etc., and the media playing on some of those roles. So it's quite interesting to look at things from that quite dynamic, quite different view from women. Next slide, please. Again, very interesting to look at the male gendered landscape, and organisations like Safer World have done an awful lot of research on this. Very important when you're looking at a gendered security policy or gendered security risk management, that you look at men as also, for example, victims of gender-based violence. I did quite a lot of work in Uganda, and there were up to 10% of men in some of the northern areas who were the victims and survivors of sexual abuse being conducted by the Lord's Resistance Army. And in a context like Uganda, where homosexuality is not recognised by the state, and that, you know, men cannot be either homosexual nor talk about male rape, it really exacerbates this issue, because it's not something that's talked about nor discussed. And to do training in these sort of areas is very, very sensitive. Secondly, that you know, playing into masculinities, you know, that the idea that men feel that their value, their worth in a lot of cultures is to be in charge, braver and more physical. And again, the need to prove themselves, perhaps compete and maybe assert their gender. And when masculinity is challenged, and I think we've probably all worked in environments like that, men tend to react quite strongly, quite hot-blooded. And again, I'm thinking about things around checkpoints, where there's that sort of clash of masculinity. But I think increasingly we're living and working in societies where men are able to perhaps express their vulnerabilities. And this is something, particularly in terms of mental health and PTSD, we need to be very, very well aware of, that there are some cultures and communities where this is never discussed, and it's not something that men would readily own up to. So it might be that we're missing a whole chunk of issues and protection around men and mental health. Next slide, please. So some data here that really just shows some of the differences and similarities in men and women's working experiences. So this is a study of security events which comes from Insecurity Insights, their quarterly aid security analysis. So they did this one in 2011 and also another one in 2015. And here they're really looking at what it is that happens to groups of men and women. So you can clearly see on that slide that in terms of women, you've got greater women who are issues of, for example, being threatened, criminal activity. You've got a lot more men who are overall injured or killed, etc. So this is quite an interesting, it's a small sample though, but an interesting dynamic to look at. Next slide, please. And again here, differences in proportion of security events affecting men and women in different environments. So again, it's quite interesting to look at the urban environment, the rural environment, and look at what sort of issues are happening to men and women in different places. So this is basically saying that more men are affected in the rural environment, more women might be affected in the urban environment. There's the issue there about water, and I think my experience would very much more be the other way around, that perhaps more women are affected when you have issues around water and conflict. So again, with data, there's not very much out there on this area, and I think it's very important for us to look to the data and then look to developing our own policies according to what we find. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I thought we would just look a little bit at different threats and risks that might affect men and women. And I've broken down groups of, that are gendered, different respective gender groups into perhaps the locals that we might work with from the host population, and then national members of staff, and then international staff. So I've got the same for men and women there. So I'd like in the chat box, if the men in the audience could look at the issues that might affect women, both local women, national women, and international women. And if the women could look at those issues affecting men, so local men, so local national members of staff and international staff. That would be fantastic. So if you could just put up in the chat box various different threats and risks that might be affecting different population groups, then we can have a chat about it. So I'll give you a few moments to put things up in the chat box. So we've got some really good ones coming in. So James is looking at unwanted sexual advances. And again, that could happen both within the organisation that the women are operating in, and also issues around issues from the population. We've got somebody there putting up sexual violence, armed robbery, and kidnap. And again, that can affect everybody, but it might be interesting to sort of tease out. Maybe armed robbery is something that happens to men more because there are more men in the security environment. You've got kidnap there as well. So we're starting to see some of those quite interesting issues coming out. Again, some of them would have a gendered aspect to them. And then we've got aggressions linked to female considered economic activities. So again, playing into those stereotypes. And again, markets, water, those sort of things. We've got one there. I'm just going to move my chat box because it's now underneath all the participants. So yeah, so we've got dress. Yes, conscription into armed groups, very much affecting young men at the moment. Boko Haram, we have a lot that comes in on Boko Haram. Conscription armed groups, dress, sexual harassment, harassment on the street. So as you can see, there are a huge number of these particular issues. And again, if we're not getting our security policies to address these, then we're probably not listening to all voices. Next slide, please. So what we really are thinking of here are environments that are conservative or subjugate women, pre-existing attitudes and bias, and we've got lack of internal buy-in perhaps to gender sensitivity and agency gender principles, maybe male dominance of security management. That's something that most definitely is something that we might want to talk about. And the idea that gender only relates to women may well be something that is stopping some of our security policies really embracing a gendered approach. And then lack of consultation. We'll touch on this again, and perhaps not getting the full representation of 50% of the population in terms of women. Next slide, please. So just looking at the gendered risk analysis. Again, we all do risk analysis, we're all very well aware of that, but it might be useful to start looking at a gendered risk analysis. Again, using the same headings. So we've got threat identification, vulnerability analysis. Again, we can bring out all those various different aspects there. Risk analysis and the threat analysis going side by side, some of the things that we've just talked about. And then the risk reduction measures and looking at that from a gender perspective. And then finally, the analysis of appropriate methods that we can use. So that's really looking at what we can actually do with this information, having brought it in. And that is the next slide, please, then. So I just thought we would spend a little bit of time thinking about a case study. It might be familiar to one or two of you in the audience because it does come from GISF, slightly adapted. So this is the case study. We've got Jim, who's an international member of staff, so working for an NGO. Carolina is a locally employed woman working for the delivery organisation. So she's just deputising for the project manager that Jim normally liaises with. So Jim calls Carolina in for a meeting out of office hours because they've been very busy. And after an hour of discussion, by the time they leave, there's no one else in the building, and he calls a local taxi for Carolina. The next day, Carolina's project manager calls an urgent meeting with Jim's boss about his conduct last night and makes allegations against him. So using the chat box, perhaps have another read, but what could have been done to avoid this situation? So just a few minutes to think about the situation and then what could have been done by the organisation, by the people concerned, to avoid this situation. So James, thank you. Yeah, not having an out of hours meeting. Yeah, and having a colleague present, Heather. Yes, absolutely. Cultural sensitivity and training. Yes, to really understand what are some of the issues there and how might this be perceived locally. So there's quite a few things there that we will perhaps unpack as we go through the next few slides. But very definitely, there are quite a few issues, sort of red flags that you've basically called up. This is a real case that GSSF brought up, highlighting sort of from Liberia, the issues of male staff. Not necessarily that they have done anything untoward, but perhaps being at high risk of extortion by being falsely accused of inappropriate behaviour. So again, we need to make sure we do protect men and we protect women as well, equally. So thanks very much indeed so far. I'm just going to hand over to Darren at this point, who's going to take up some of these considerations. Darren, over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. And I think the key word that Kathy touched on earlier is we're literally just going to scratch the surface here. And obviously it's a much broader topic, but for the time being, we're just going to drill down into the type of things that we can do at I suppose, an operational level, the lower level, in terms of threat and risk analysis. So we've already been through the key elements of gender risk analysis. And once we've conducted this, we really should have identified the key threats within the organisation, and then the level of risk that we're facing. Now, bearing in mind that if we're doing this properly, each person within the organisation is likely to face different levels of risk depending on who they are. Okay, so really when we are asking this, and when we're going back to the previous slide that Kathy was looking at, we're looking at speaking to each individual in terms of assessing their key vulnerabilities and their key concerns so that we can really tailor the approach for each individual. Now, what we're really looking at doing is trying to create a situation or a scenario whereby we don't have to face what has happened in this situation. So really we're looking at reducing the opportunity for the threat to take place. So Jim is in a position whereby it appears okay for him to call a meeting out of hours with limited attendees, and those points were already brought up by other members on this call. So already people look at this and thinking, well, there's some key problems. So if we already know this, then we might want to start thinking about protocols and procedures based around those. The next thing we're looking at is reducing the exposure to the threat. So that being that Carolina feeling obliged to go to a meeting or being allowed to go to a meeting that is out of working hours. And a question of working hours, which we will come to in a moment. So if we are looking at meeting procedures, for example, then some simple guidelines or some simple tips or things to consider might be the following. So as a meeting host, I should be considering the needs of the participants coming to that meeting, and perhaps even sending out the procedures for those people that are new to the organisation or coming into the organisation, just as a measure of reassurance. These are the following standards that we set in place for all of our meetings and being conducted. Yeah, James, absolutely use Zoom. And that's certainly something that we can discuss out of hours. Zoom is, why not? We've certainly got used to it. So if I'm going to a meeting on the other hand, or I'm responsible for individuals going to a meeting, then I probably need to start considering what we expect of those hosting us. It makes it a lot easier if a senior management level pushes out to externals, okay, this is how we expect our meetings to be conducted for the individuals that we're pushing in. That's a basic level of duty of care that we're providing at that stage. And that way it takes a lot of pressure off the individuals that are going to those meetings. And again, it's that reassurance, and they know what they should be facing. And we've set the bar. This is the level that we expect. Now, if we can't impose our measures, and I appreciate that sometimes culturally or internationally, there are different levels of what's expected and what's anticipated. Okay, we need to then find a way of working around those so that we are still meeting a level that is acceptable within our policies of duty of care. So, timings. Asked a moment ago, what happens if you're constantly working out of hours? Okay, well, and that's fine. And I can't say that every time I've been overseas working, it's always been 9 till 5 and the office door shuts and everyone goes home in daylight hours. It clearly doesn't work like that. But what we need to do is start working out how best we engage with that subject. And if we are going to have meetings outside of hours, then we maybe need to start thinking about the number of attendees. And then potentially, we've also got to get people home. If we have meetings out of hours, we need to then start considering the additional threat, which is perhaps raised when we start asking people to travel home out of hours. So I think for the moment, it's just a case of asking these questions, saying, right, what actually fits within our organisation and what levels are we willing to tolerate in terms of the risk level. So timings might be one thing, and of course the addition of attendees. So we define our minimum number of attendees, and potentially just clamp down and say absolutely, no after hours meetings. I mean, it seems slightly draconian and it potentially doesn't work, but it's a consideration that needs to be made. So attendees knowing who is going to be at a meeting that they're heading to. So if I'm going to a meeting outside of my own office, I'd also like to know who is going to be at that meeting. So there's no surprises when I'm expecting to meet with 4 or 5 people and suddenly it's just a one-on-one. So again, it's that degree of preparedness. And then we can start looking at locations, considering the types of locations and perhaps having a list of approved locations, whether that is the building itself that we think is acceptable, or whether actually it's just in terms of setup and meeting rooms that we know and understand. We might also start to consider, can this meeting be held in a public space? There's 2 types of public space. There's a public space within an office, or there's a public space outside of an office, so generally a larger The issue, however, if we start having discussions in public spaces, is obviously the sensitivity of the topics that we may need to talk about. And so there may be a line there. So just moving on then, the room setup. So from a personal perspective, I don't like to go into a meeting room and be sat with my back to the door. I like to know if the door is opening whilst I'm in conversation with someone, who is coming into that room. I don't imagine that most people in the room enjoy sitting with their back to a door and finding a door open. It's slightly disconcerting, especially if it's a new location. If I'm the host, then what I'm going to start to consider in terms of the room setup is where I place myself. What I wouldn't want to do to someone attending one of my meetings is place myself between the door and them. There's just absolutely no need. So we start to consider the feelings and the needs of other people that are coming into those meetings. We may also start to consider an open door policy. Distancing, this certainly isn't new to us at the moment. COVID-19 has obviously increased distancing, but what we're really talking about as if we were to take COVID-19 away from the situation, we're talking about your personal space and having someone perched right on your shoulder, leaning over the top of you to look at your screen on your laptop. Again, a lot of people just find that slightly offensive and slightly awkward. So there's no reason for these things to happen. So it shouldn't be left for the individual to explain to the other individual that is in close proximity with them. It should be absolutely clear in terms of policy that we do not expect you to, conduct yourself in this way and to consider other people's personal space. In an ideal situation, we're looking at natural barriers within a meeting room, desks placed, and potentially a shared screen, so a larger shared screen. So no one has to come in to your personal space to look over your shoulder at your screen. You're already connected to a large screen that everyone can see. The next element I'd advise people to start looking at would be your strategy development. And really that is how we're going to deal with a situation that we feel uncomfortable with. So we have entered into a situation, it is not what we expected, and it goes against the guidelines and policies of our organization. If we already know that our organization is going to support us in these situations, and we have a strategy in place in terms of how you're going to exit from that situation that you're uncomfortable with, then you're in a much better place. When we find ourselves, with a policy or a strategy that we don't know or understand, it's much harder to try and think on your feet quickly to try and extract yourself from that situation. Again, if it's been engagement at senior management between organizations, it's much easier to say, actually, this meeting doesn't conform with the standards that we expect. Is there any chance we can make the following adjustments, in order that it meets our policies? Because my company is very strict on this, whatever it happens to be. It's a simple example, but one that, again, just needs to be considered so that people know where the boundaries are and how they'll be supported. So, as I said, we're literally just scratching the surface here, and we really are just talking about meetings at this stage. What we don't have time to go into is to discuss any forms of physical confrontation and the thought process and the cycles around that. That's something that we go into much more, as Kathy's already mentioned, on hostile environment awareness training, so heat training, and it is really a much broader subject than the time that we have available now. But understanding that there are various tiers that we can go through in terms of protecting ourselves before we would ever find ourselves, or ideally find ourselves, in that situation. I'm going to hand back over to Kathy now. There's a Q&A session right at the end, and we can go through any other questions that people may have at that point. Thanks very much, Kathy.
Next slide, please. Thank you very much, Darren. So what we're looking at, picking up on that last point, is one way that we can protect ourselves is very much so is the NGO leadership. So whether that's private sector or NGO leadership, making sure that there is leadership from the very top. And I've got some, I'll come back at the end and we'll talk about culture and leadership and leading that through. So you need a culture that should be open with safe reporting. And again, it's very, very important to think about safe reporting, because if you're in a place like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Chechnya, it's very, very difficult for women to speak of threats like GBV, attacks on their honour, their reputation in front of male colleagues. And that puts them at huge risk if they're being asked to do that. And similarly, if we're thinking about the context that I spoke about before, like in Uganda, again, it puts men in very, very difficult positions if they're being asked to talk about attacks on themselves. So we have to be very mindful about what we mean by an open culture and make sure that we think specifically about the cultural context. Again, as one of you mentioned earlier in the chat, cultural context must be part of the induction. As some contexts may be more difficult, and maybe it's worth doing some scenario training before you go out about some of these issues. We've talked about gendered security risks and threats, and I've given you just a rough outline of a gendered risk analysis. All staff should take sexual exploitation and abuse training, including local partners, to make sure that everybody is on board. Again, the idea of using sex disaggregated data. So whenever we do security training and whenever we're looking at that, we're really gathering that data. All voices are heard. Now, again, I've said that it's a very male-orientated environment, and as a woman who's often been deployed, it does certainly feel like that. But unless people are taken seriously, and men and women are being taken through this process equally, then we're not going to get the right security for everybody. I'm now going to hand over to Louise, who is a global security analyst, and she's going to take us through the next few slides. Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be taking you through the phases of response and recovery, which from an organizational perspective are very important in the event of an incident occurring. These two phases are not necessarily distinct phases, and more often than not, they will be conducted sequentially. So looking at the first point there, it's important to ensure there are options for making reports and also ensuring that there is a referral mechanism in place. And those are to include several channels with focal points. Those will be the primary contact, so it should be people prepared and well trained, as they will be showing victims what sort of resources are available and what options they have. Also at this stage, we want to be looking at setting up a log of the event. This will help us to keep track of any information received, actions carried out, and also any responsibilities. This document is essential not only to track the event, but also it will be useful for any type of after action review afterwards. So second point, sensitive incident reporting. So in the case of a sensitive incident, which is very much the case for any sort of gender-based violence, it's important to create a safe space, ensure confidentiality and information sharing. Another important thing to point out here is to take no action without the victim's consent. Second point here, if chosen or if needed, it's very important to refer or go with the victim and facilitate her or his access to medical care, be it to treat injuries or to have access to the right medication. This here includes also physical as well as psychological support. This not only in the short term, but also in the longer term and as a follow-up. We should here consider access both through external or internal mechanisms. Similarly, ensure access to legal advice in form of both the benefits and the consequences of pursuing legal action. This is really important, legal support in such cases where impunity does tend to prevail. It's essential as well, last point, to consider security incident analysis. This will include reviewing processes that we have in place, making amendments if necessary, and at this stage, we'll be looking at post weaknesses in our current procedures, evaluating maybe new training for personnel if necessary, and checking if everything correct was put in place and if anything could have avoided the incident. At this stage, we can also ask, is there anything that can be put into place right now with immediate effect? Next slide, please, Rosie. So thinking of incident management phases, we can see here a summary of actions which we have explored today. This is a continuous process, starting with prevention, but it depends on the situation. At different times, we may focus more heavily on a specific area. This phase is also important to remember do not take place in isolation. For example, if we look at the response phase, we might also have to look at prevention of similar incidents in the immediate future. So let's just quickly go through the list. We have at the beginning of the webinar explore identifying threats and having a gender lens to those threats, and then assessing the risk, that is to say the likelihood of these threats from happening, and finally conducting a gendered risk assessment and implementing mitigation measures. Then looking at preparation, here we're really looking at developing procedures, safeguarding protocols, and gender sensitive policies. And then of course, raising awareness, acceptance and compliance throughout the organization and our staff. At this stage, we also have to be looking at training and safety courses. Then we've got the phase of response and recovery, which I have just spoken to you about, instant reporting, having the referral mechanisms in place, and conducting a security incident analysis. And finally, recovery, ensuring the correct mechanisms are in place, that the victim has access to healthcare and legal advice as necessary. I will now hand over back to Kathy. She will guide you through some conclusions and final points. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Louise, for that. So my last two slides are really looking at culture and how we, I mean, that's so important, culture and leadership, a solution and cause, and looking at internal and external contexts. So the two bullets that I've put at the top of that slide there, if you get it wrong, then it becomes a threat. You get it right and it becomes a protective asset. So getting the culture of your organisation right and understanding the culture in which you're operating is absolutely crucial. There's an excerpt there from Violence is Not Our Culture, which really sort of sums it up there. Both state and non-state actors increasingly using culture to, inverted commas, justify carrying out violence against women, but also I need to add in there against young boys as well as men. When these acts are given legitimacy, whether at international or regional levels, it promotes the idea that there's an inherent cultural right to execute violence among certain communities. Patently unacceptable and must be rejected. I mean, there's so much we could talk about here. I had a career in the military, and it's very interesting that some of the work in Afghanistan, when you're dealing with people who are blatantly using dancing boys, you have that issue of human rights. And then early on, there was the lack of understanding around some of those issues by the UK military, I would say, and also the need to therefore break away from liaising with people who are blatantly breaking those sort of human rights conventions. But there's a lot of work we can do to discuss some of these issues in the chat if you want to afterwards. So there really is a need for leadership and top level championing. And my final slide, next slide please, is going to be looking at something that we've used before. This is the leadership shadow, and it basically is looking at how the leadership that you portray, that you deliver, will cast a shadow over your employees and the organisations that you're working with. And often this can be a force multiplier, a force for good, or again, it can be a spiral of negativity. So you've got there 4 elements to it. Really the values, the context, the messaging, delivering a compelling case for being inclusive, for gender inclusivity, celebrating any progress there might be, and that includes working with local personnel, with national staff, with international staff. And then top right, you've got their behaviours, symbols and relationships. Again, there's so much more we can do to unpack this model. But again, it's about being a role model for an inclusive culture, building that top team with a critical mass of women. And again, it's not difficult to try and, if you're working with delivery organisations, mandate that they have a certain percentage, for example, of women in their workforce. That there's an awful lot that we can do at an operational level to try and really drill down into being inclusive, and then calling out behaviours and decisions that are not consistent with an inclusive culture. I've got a picture of General David Morrison there on the right from the Australian Army. He did a phenomenal job, lots of incredible speeches on YouTube that you can have a look at. but he actually changed the Australian Army around in the space of a year and a half, from being one in which there was a culture of abuse to one in which he made it plainly obvious that that was going to be unacceptable. He worked with the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Elizabeth Broderick, and they came up with this model with McKinsey, using all the information from top CEOs as well. So this leadership shadow model is quite an interesting one, and one that you can use in your organisations as well. The bottom two boxes look at the sort of disciplines, routines, and interactions that you have. And again, what Darren was speaking to earlier about meetings and processes and all of that sort of thing should be something that's encompassed in some of those SOPs. And then finally, on the left, rewards, recognition, and accountability. Setting targets, holding yourself and your team accountable, making sure you've got sort of smart objectives for dealing with some of these issues around gender equality. So there's an awful lot that we can do with our organisations, with the people that we work closely with, in order to try and tackle some of these issues around gender and security. But from my perspective, cultural change and leadership from the top are some of the key ways that we can take this forward. So thanks very much indeed. I'm going to now hand back to the team for some question and answers. So Darren, over to you.
Okay, just thanks very much, Kathy. We are amazingly almost at a close. I appreciate the sensitivity of this subject. So I'm just going to give a couple of housekeeping points for the Q&A session. So if you've got any good questions, now's your opportunity to get those out to the team. If the nature of your question is such that you don't wish to be associated with your question, then by all means, if you use, you'll see you're on everyone at the moment, and I said I'd come back to this. If you look at there's a drop box, and if you can identify either myself, Kathy, Louise or Rosie, and ask the question to us directly, then we'll happily ask that question on your behalf, so that you don't have to be associated with that question. And then obviously you'll get the best possible answer. The next thing, thank you, Rosie, is I think we're there already. If you want to put your cameras on so we can see who we're talking to, then please feel free. We'll do our absolute level best to get through the questions, but as I said, we are fairly tight on time on a subject that is A, sensitive, and B, quite large, and we could probably go for a while on it. So that's enough talking, Neil. We are going to run out of time. I'll hand it over to you. And the chat box, please fire away. Kathy, there's a question from James there.
Yeah.
So how do you practically present a role model in a non-inclusive society, for example, LGBTQ leader? And then the example is somewhere like Pakistan, for example.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think we probably won't crack it in the time that we've got available, but I think these are the sort of things that we do need to think about. Not only role modelling, but also how to be inclusive at the same time. It's not an easy win somewhere like Pakistan, but I think the more we know about the local culture, and the more we ourselves are sensitive and sensitised towards it, I think that puts us in a better framework. But a great question, and something that would be really interesting to discuss offline.
James, thanks very much for that question. Actually, a couple of the members of the Spearfish team are online, and both Pakistani nationals and based in Pakistan at the moment. So if that's something you wish to go to more detail offline, then that's something that we can happily take up with you. But as Kathy said, it is not an easy subject to broach, and would take a little bit of work to make sure it's done in a sensitive manner. I'd just like to pick up on something. I hope you don't mind. Heather asked earlier or mentioned, we were talking about meetings, and then James actually said, well, you could switch to Zoom potentially, when we were talking about the scenario and meetings out of hours. And actually something that Heather raised, which we are seeing a massive increase in, is actually harassment and online harassment. So again, I don't know whether those attending have seen an increase in that with COVID, or if that's been something that's been gradually on the rise anyway, just by the nature of the work that we do. Okay, I've got Neslis, and I think, excuse me if I've pronounced your name incorrectly, but stalking the personal messages, but can't be stopped. With regards, what personal messages? Are we phone, Skype, or is it? I think when we, and again, it depends on country to country. When it comes to online stalking and harassment, I would expect that would fall into a criminal bracket and therefore would involve police. I appreciate it's not always that clear cut, but it's something that certainly needs to be considered at that stage, and that there are lines that need to be drawn in Yahoo Mail messages. Yeah. I think certainly the UK at the moment is seeing huge issues with social media, especially with regards to racism, because apparently social media can't track those that are putting these messages out. So again, a larger issue, but one that we should absolutely be aware of. And if staff, are finding that they're being harassed in some way, then it's absolutely the duty of the company to try and intervene in some way and try and assist that person. I don't know, Kathy, if you've got anything to add there.
No, I agree. I think I was also looking at the one about the relationship being illegal when you were talking about LGBTI. So again, I worked with people in Uganda, and there was a very real fear that people could be arrested, they could be imprisoned if their relationships got out, or even if they were heard talking about things like male rape. So again, yes, I mean, it's something that we do need to tackle, but again, perhaps that would be something that we could have another discussion about.
Just out of interest, and this is not a name and shame, but are organisations starting to engage with gender-based risk analysis? Is that something that we're starting to see more of?
Is that to you, Louise?
I think this topic definitely, just, talking about it and getting people to adapt and look at threats with this gender lens that we spoke about at the beginning of the webinar. I think we have definitely have seen a rise in that. And I think we'll be seeing more and more. Katy, you spoke about, for example, also looking at within, the bracket of women or men, local and international. This is something that I think need more attention, but I think we're starting to see more gender mainstreaming and analyzing risks with that lens.
There was also a question that came up in the chat box about IOs and UN. How do they take this more seriously rather than it be a tick box? Yeah, I mean, that's something really difficult. I advised NATO for a while, and there's been a massive change in NATO over the last, I would say, 8 years. Really now getting on board with this and human security, gender mainstream, etc. And I know that there's been a lot of work recently in the UN with some of the, I think it was about 3 years ago, that they now say that 15% of the TCCs should be females, so 15% should be female peacekeepers. I think the problem we're finding with that is they tend to be counting their clerks and their cooks, who tend to be women, as in that bracket. So you might have They might be able to tick the box to say that they've got 15% of women, but they're not necessarily women that are going to be used in a forward-facing peacekeeping role. However, that we have gender advisors now, a lot more common, a lot more widely understood and used. So I think it's slowly by slowly, it's people like us, it's people spreading the word, it's people from bottom up asking that some of these things are included in gender policy, gender mainstreaming policy. We can do as much as we can in our own organisations, going up and outwards, and then just have to hope that that those that are in the policy making chairs will make the right decisions.
I'd just like to, there's a couple of points being raised regarding vulnerability and disability, and how actually that is, there are increased cases of GBV, of targeting as a result of that. And I think, yeah, absolutely. I think wherever we're looking at what's the distinctions, then people, people are, more vulnerable, and therefore, potentially open to exploitation of any sort. There was a question a moment ago from Shireen regarding risk assessment in terms of female travellers, and it's absolutely something that we're looking into, or starting to conduct more and more. I mean, again, the subject that we've drawn into today was raised for a whole host of reasons, but one specific was regarding the amount of times that we are coming across, whether it's on hostile environment training or whether it's in briefings for female travellers, where they are raising issues that they have either faced in the past, or refocusing the briefing based on their own personal concerns and issues, which is absolutely the way it needs to be. Rather than the briefing, it needs to be that dialogue element, and I think it's something that needs to be improved across the sector and across the industry. There was another question about the male demographic in the security sector. Kathy, is that something you wish to field?
Probably not really. I can't do justice to it in the time.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, my personal perspective, I think that we're seeing, and thankfully, an increasing number of security specialists coming from non-military, non-police backgrounds, although that is generally the recruiting ground for the security sector. And I think as we start to see, I suppose, a better understanding from individuals that there is a lot to be gained from having individuals that have worked within the sector and then moved into more of a security role, I think we'll be in a stronger position as a sector as we go forwards in that respect. So I do see a change. And I do think it'll be positive as it starts to come through. Are there any other questions from the floor? I'm just going to scan back across any to see if I've missed any questions. If you feel I've missed a question and not answered it, then please just fire back through, and Kathy, Louise.
There's one that came in about how do we encourage women to report GBV at work. I think, bearing in mind what I've said about the culture in some areas, it's also about having that organisational culture where people feel able to report, and that's not necessarily something that that is a quick fix. It's about trust. It's about developing that trust. It's about people feeling secure enough to divulge something, and that there will be action taken. Louise, I don't know whether you want to add to that.
Yeah, just to add on that, like I spoke about in the response phase, it's important to create a safe space. And another important thing, several channels, and across these channels to have different points of contact and primary contact to encourage these people to be comfortable in reporting those cases. So really looking at creating an environment where people will feel safe to report. I think that's very important.
If I could just go back on to a question that was actually raised by Pippa, which was regarding a move away from white, older male demographic in terms of your security providers. ultimately, what this goes back to is training within the security organisations to understand the questions that they need to be asking. And so they have their own culture of gender sensitivity. There are many things that I faced overseas which are going to be completely different to those that Louise has faced overseas potentially. And so therefore my thinking, my understanding needs to be turned in order that I have a better understanding of how it may look from the other side. And the best way to do that is ultimately engaging in conversation whereby people can express those concerns and those issues, because they may differ to what I expect, and not just across the male female. Again, it's been raised whether it's disability, ethnicity, the list needs to be engaged with, but each person treated as individual, like I mentioned right at the beginning, and that's where we're going to start making sure that individuals' needs are assessed properly before they travel, so that we understand slightly better. Okay. Well, if there's no more questions from the floor, Rosie, if I could just have the next slide just quickly, please. So what I didn't introduce at the beginning, and just very quickly, so Louise and I run a team of regional security advisors, a network of local nationals within their host countries, and it's those individuals that will provide you the security advice before you travel, security advice when you're on the ground, whether that's working full-time within a project, part-time embedded within a country, or whether it's regional support depending on the threat levels. But ultimately, it's those individuals that can assist you in developing the cultural understanding and sensitivity to the needs, understanding what it means exactly to a traveller or a project working overseas, and ultimately can assist you with the development of policies and procedures to help you manage and manoeuvre when you're working. That is the only part of the network that I'll go into. But ultimately, there's a team, as I mentioned earlier. Some of the questions being raised there were specifically regards Pakistan, and two of the individuals that we have on this call are regional security advisors within Pakistan. So we have the ability to reach out. And if we're not embedded within a country, our turnaround time is around about 4 weeks in order to get someone up, trained to our standards, and then embedded within an organisation. So for your needs and requirements when travelling, that is how we operate. All I would say, thank you very much to Kathy. A superb briefing, and I'm sure everyone else will agree. And thank you very much to Louise as well. And thank you to those of you that took the time to ask questions, to attend, and to listen. I hope it's been extremely useful. It's always a pleasure having the opportunity to brief and chat to you all. So if there's anything else, I think our emails are available. But please stay safe and take care. And thank you very much.